I want to start as well with acknowledging the Wurundjeri people and all Aboriginal people on whose land, the Wurundjeri people land we meet, the Aboriginal people who have cared for the land we all enjoy for thousands of years, and also acknowledge the resistance to the system that is destroying our environment, that is driving a genocide in Gaza, that drove a genocide on this continent. And I think that's particularly important because of the way that resistance has been buried in popular consciousness. I think, it's important to discuss the nature of Australian settler colonialism and imperialism in the context of what we just discussed in the first session about Australian government support for the genocide in Gaza. And I think many people have been looking at what the Australian government has been doing, has been saying, and seeing the parallels with the settler colonial project and its genocidal origins on this continent. And in that, seeing a potential explanation for why they do support Israel so strongly. And I think the parallels are very clear for everyone to see. I think in the story of the genocide that we're watching unfold, in terms of, you have this intensification of the oppression, the blockade, the siege, the intensification of the land theft, of the attacks and destruction of the land of the Palestinian people, which provokes the inevitable resistance from the colonized people, and that serves as a pretext for all that genocidal massacre that we're seeing in Gaza. That's a story that has been played out all across this continent over and over again, and is at the heart of what actually established and is at the heart of the nature of the Australian capitalist system that was established on this continent. But despite that, I think there are also important differences with what has driven that genocide and dispossession in Palestine, the nature of the settler colonialism that has emerged, that was discussed in the first session, and the nature of the settler colonial project here. And that has important implications in terms of what it is that motivates Australia's support for Israel, and what that means for how we can fight both the oppression of Indigenous people here and their support for imperialism. Liam talked about Israeli settler colonialism as financed by imperialism but not exploited by it, and I think that's what it gets the essence of some of what is fundamentally different about the context here. So what is it that drove the settler colonial project of Australia? I think the first thing to understand is, like Israel, it's a process that's absolutely driven by imperialism, the system of competition between states, which is built into the capitalist system. I think it's important to explain a little bit about actually what the dynamic behind this process is, which is at the heart of the system of capitalism, that you have competition for profit as being built into the way that it works, the need that flows out of this to continually expand, continually get larger and larger profits, to get more share of the markets of resources, more share of labour in order to maintain these against rivals. And at the same time, inevitably, fundamentally, the state, the organization of the armed forces, armed bodies of people, is inevitably drawn into this competition, because it needs the economic profits that are produced by capitalism for its functioning, for its power, for its legitimacy to rule. And in turn, actually, the capitalist system, or the system of exploitation of private property, of markets, needs this armed power of the state, because actually that you need a mechanism to intervene, to settle strikes in favour of the employer when workers won't settle in any other way, to deal with the immense social misery that's created when you're pushing people onto the streets and creating kind of social catastrophes. And in the case of the establishment of capitalism on this continent, to deal with the Indigenous populations who stand in the way of further expansion of the system. And it's this kind of reciprocal interaction between the state and its armed forces on the one hand, and the capitalist accumulation of economic accumulation on the other, which is at the heart of what drives imperialism as the competition between states, and what drove the settler colonial project on this content. So first of all, in terms of what drove colonization of Australia, first of all, you got the industrial capitalism in Britain, which is, the state is playing a very key role in closing the commons, pushing people into the cities and the factories and making them fodder for the new sort of profit system. And this leads to this bulging prison population, surplus population, this immense social misery. And colonizing Australia, in part, is a way to deal with that and actually trying to maintain the social stability of the system that was being created in Britain. But this is only possible and is connected with another process, which is actually the expansion of the system internationally and the imperialist competition that comes with that. So the colonization of Australia comes in a context of intensifying of where capitalist imperialism is beginning to become global, driven by the scale of industrial production that's happening in Europe and is expanding into the Pacific, Africa, and Asia for the first time, which brings with it this intensification of competition between the European imperialist powers in this region. So you had the Dutch, who had just charted the coast off Australia. You had the presence of France in the Pacific. This is a key motivation for why Britain wants to establish a settler colony in Australia, because they're looking at who is going to own the South Pacific and who's going to dominate here. And so actually, when they planted the flag in Sydney Cove, they declared the whole eastern half of the continent of what became Australia and all the adjacent Pacific Islands and New Zealand, claimed for British Crown and one of the biggest land thefts in the history of humanity. But to actually make that a reality would actually take the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people to establish that. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the kind of society that British settler capitalism encountered when they came onto this continent, which was what we would say is a classless society. That actually it was not unlike the society that was brought here, a society of rich and poor, of rulers and ruled, of disastrous destruction of the environment and destructive wars, of catastrophic oppression, and all the rest of it. That it was actually a system of reciprocal, based on a reciprocal relations of respect, both for each other and for the natural world. And I think that makes it important for all of us who want to see a world beyond class and beyond this system to actually to recognize what is significant about the profound civilization that has lived on this continent for 65,000 years. But initially, actually, the reception to British capitalism, it's not the case that people were automatically hostile to the presence of people on this continent. And I think that's an important thing to talk about. And there's quite touching examples of the relationships and collaboration between Aboriginal people and British people in particular instances in a whole number of ways. But actually, where that begins to change is as all across the continent, when the frontier where that begins to change is with the expansion of the pastoral system, of actually trying to push outwards to establish cattle farms, to establish more profits for the system, and to expand the colony for that. So you had, from the initial settlement in Sydney, you had the big expansion of farming and cattle out to Hawkesbury and Nepean River. And at this point, this is really mostly driven by individual leases that are given to ex-convicts, soldiers, and free settlers. So often, working people themselves who are actually given a stake in the new colonial enterprise by going out and being able to take a bit of land to make their own livelihood from. And this brings the British into conflict with the Eora, the Darug, and the Gundungurra as the farms block the access to water, to fishing and yam beds, and there's actually causes a mass hunger in the middle of 1788 when they come, and Indigenous people resist this. At this point, it's mainly kind of attacks on particular farms and cattle, but these are responded to with all out brutal massacres. So the example from the Sydney War from this period is the Governor Arthur Phillips, who gives an order in 1790 that any Aboriginal people must be massacred in reprisal for the killing of stock and should be hung up in trees in order to convince the natives of the superiority of the British and strike terror into their hearts. But at this stage, the scale of penetration into the continent is much more limited, and it's actually when the scale massively ratchets it up as the British come in and intervene and say, you can't be giving so many ex-convicts rewards for coming to Australia in the form of land. You need to ratchet up the scale of profits. There's quite an organic pressure in order to expand the scale of profits in order for the settlement to survive. So the land leases are opened up for big, wealthy landowners who then, to take much larger portions of land and employ much larger numbers of people on those in order to do that. And it's that expansion of pastoral capitalism that leads to an all-out war across the continent with Indigenous people. Maybe because I'm already got 10 minutes, I'll skip over some of the details about this. But just one point about the interaction with this state. Like, often, actually, the expansion of the settlement is under pressure, both from this resistance to secure a military advantage against the Indigenous people that they're fighting, as well as under that economic pressure as well. And that leads to the expansion, the land leases opening up into the Blue Mountains, leading to a massive war with the Wiradjuri and among other tribes. But the outcome of these wars, I mean, there's a series of kind of wars. That outcome is the absolute genocidal massacres and decimation of Aboriginal life to make way for the pastoral system. The consequence of which ultimately is that these land leases are being taken up by more and more established pastoral companies, directed by banks or by powerful capitalists enmeshed in much broader commercial networks, and state governments are ultimately formed and consolidated directly by these pastoral capitalists, creating a new ruling class who are directly controlling the affairs in the particular colonies. And this in turn leads to an even more rapid expansion of the pastoral industry as the state, in the same way that the actual economic development begins to increase the scale of profit making, increase of technology and innovation, the scale of warfare and of the ability to massacre the Indigenous people is wrapped up in turn. So you have, after the Queensland Parliament is established by the landowners, the ruling class in New South Wales, you had the Queenslander boasted that during no preceding time in the whole history of our colonisation here had there been an equal breadth of new country taken up and stocked in any of the colonies. So I've said all this, and so it's really out of this process that you get the formation of an Australian capitalist ruling class independent of Britain. No longer directly a product of British imperialism, but actually an organic ruling class with its own interests on this continent that it's trying to maintain. And central to this is, as I said, the development of state machines. The state machines that are developed out of the massacres of Indigenous people to pave the way for the settler colony. It's actually the formation and the coming together, binding together the ruling class in terms of coalescing around a national agenda that is backed by the armed force of the state. And what this went along with was the development of an increasing recognition of an independent imperialist interests of Britain. So it's no longer just British imperialists' concern about the competition with the rival imperialist states in the Pacific, but Australia has a particular interest in dominating the South Pacific that is independent of Britain. So in the second half of the 19th century, you get heavier lobbying of Britain for a more aggressive military posture in the Pacific, and the Australian ruling class is expressing concerns about the security of trade routes and the maintenance of their strategic position against imperialist powers. In 1890, you had the leading politicians who, again, these land-owning class, many of these people whose descendants still own the land, who still have, control wealthy land to this day. These were the politicians of the foundation of Australia. In 1890, at a conference of the colonies, they proclaimed the Australian Monroe Doctrine, declaring that Australia cannot be secure if any other power is allowed to establish itself between the Australian coast and South America. And the delegates at this conference also passed the first resolutions on the need for a federation of the colonies with power over the Pacific Islands as well. And so I think the key point in this story is in 1883, which is at the height of the massacres of Aboriginal people on the northern frontier. You have the Queensland Premier McElraith, I think is his name, sent an expedition to plant the Union Jack at Port Moresby and annex New Guinea to Queensland. Which there's the out of the concern about the Dutch encroachment in the area, and the Convention of the Colonies thing I mentioned is really to rally behind that. And the brother of McIlwraith spelt out the perspective of Australian imperialism behind this when he said, "The principal objects sought by the present annexation are the protection of the Australian colonies from the interference or domination of a foreign power and the conservation of our commercial interests in the southern seas and in connection with New Guinea." But actually, that was not the agenda of Britain. The Britain were much more worried about the reaction from their imperial rivals in areas they considered much more strategically important, like the Middle East. And so this is an important moment for the Australian ruling class, who learnt an important lesson about the need to increase their own independent strength and initiative in pursuing their imperialist agenda. And this actually, it puts forward, the arguments for federation and the establishment of the Australian state, come out of this. So you had Henry Parkes, who's the Premier of New South Wales, use this to bolster his calls for federation during the 1890 convention. And he said, "I have no doubt whatever in my mind, if Australia had spoken with one voice in the year 1883, New Guinea would have belonged to Australia." And so the formation, just to emphasize the overall thing I've been saying, is that the formation of a federated Australian state is fundamentally a consequence of the way that competition for profit had drove pastoral expansion, the interaction between this and the creation of organised armed bodies of people to guarantee this could happen by wiping out Indigenous populations who stood in their way. But to pursue a specifically Australian imperialist interests, they still could not ignore the importance of the major imperialist power of the day, which was Britain, in being able to provide the security against the much more powerful rivals that were competing in the region. And so out of this develops a strategy of the Australian ruling class of looking to support the larger world imperialist powers. At the time it was Britain, and later after World War II it's the United States, to look to support their imperialist agenda as a down payment for making sure that they will support Australia's aggression in the Pacific. And so, it's in this same period that you have the participation in all of these British, colonial wars. There's the point that Henry Reynolds makes about the Australian War Memorial, that commemorating, the war in Sudan as the first conflict that of Australia that Australia participated in. Incredible, given there had been just this massive scale of warfare with the Indigenous people on this continent. But the adventure in Sudan was a very small number of people doing menial jobs, not fighting at all, some of them getting diseases and then, coming back. But the importance of this was that it was a way of bolstering Australian imperialism, and it began a long tradition of participation and support for military expeditions on behalf of Britain and later the US. Which are very celebrated, in our schools, in our national mythology, for all their, seemingly irrelevance for what Australia is immediately involved in. And I think this is important to emphasize in terms of the context of support for Israel, that actually the importance of Israel that we went over in the first session as to unite to the imperialism of the United States is central to why Australia supports it, that it's the world dominance of the United States through its control of the oil, its control of the strategic straits, which makes Israel important as part of Australia's strategy in terms of actually, backing US imperialism and dominance and pulling them as much as they possibly can into maintaining their own dominance of imperialism in the Pacific. And the development of Australian imperialism is also an intensification, leads to an intensification of racism in terms of racism towards the people of the regions they're looking to dominate, the anti-Asian racism and racism towards people in the Pacific, the Islamophobia and anti-racism that helps to justify their imperialist ambitions of their larger sponsors in the Middle East, whether it's more recent examples, whether it's Palestine, the war in Iraq, or Afghanistan. But I think the other thing that's really crucial to understand about this process is the way, unlike in Israel, what it created was a working class, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, with both a power and interest to challenge this racism, challenge their imperialism, and challenge the settler colonial logic of the Australian ruling class. So, the shift from small landholding given to these individual workers that were meant to have this stake in the thing, to actually having these big landowners that are driving the colonization, that leads to actually a situation where they are exploiting much larger numbers of people, Indigenous people as well as non-Indigenous people, who are brought into actually producing for the capitalist system and exploited as part of that. And that gives them a power actually to resist the system and an interest in opposing the wars they are dragged into as cannon fodder on behalf of the working class, in standing against the oppression of Indigenous people who are suffering as a consequence of the same system that, you know, that pushes them down. And so I just, to end with, I wanted to give the story that really the culmination of this process in this powerful story of what working class solidarity, you know, of the creation of that working class means for actually being able to resist this brutal system and its racism and imperialism, which is that, you know, that process I was talking about, the genocidal expansion of pastoral capitalism. At the beginning of the 20th century, the ruling class had been trying to establish this in East Arnhem Land on Yolngu country, but had failed. Partly because of the resistance of the Yolngu people themselves, who speared the cattle, who attacked the stations, and who fought to keep the pastoralists off their lands. And they had faced a number of frightful massacres because of it. But by the 1930s, these massacres were ended by workers' action. The last planned government-led massacre of Indigenous people was organised by the police with the support of the Australian government after a Yolngu leader, whose name was Dakia, speared a police officer when he found his wife and a number of other women chained by the police. But by this time, you know, unlike the previous instances of this kind of resistance, there was a working class trade union movement in the cities, which involved Aboriginal activists, worked with Aboriginal activists, and many of the Aboriginal people who were resisting the genocide on their own land against the frontier violence ended up in prison cells alongside unemployed workers who were being radicalized in huge numbers as the system was throwing them into the incredible hardship and hunger during the beginning of the Great Depression. And a mass anti-war movement had been organized within unions and working class communities as the Second World War was approaching. And when news of this planned massacre hit these massive anti-war meetings, they turned into Stop the War on Aborigines meetings, and they organized to stop the massacre. And the Communist Party, which was very leading a very strong unemployed workers movement, as well as the anti-war movement, they celebrated Dakia's courage for spearing a police officer and said that any Aboriginal person had a right to kill police officers who had been sent to take their land by force. They passed 70 resolutions by a range of workers' organisations, including peak union bodies, and at its height, you had a mass meeting of over 500 people in Melbourne with a former federal Labor Attorney General who argued that any killing by Indigenous people of those sent on punitive expeditions to massacre them was justifiable homicide, which is just, you know, this is making it impossible for them to actually be able to get away with this massacre. And that level of support and that power of the working class forced an end to the long period of open frontier warfare that had, you know, seen the brutality of the genocidal Australian state, you know, since 1788. And that's the power we need to look to fight Indigenous oppression and against the imperialist support, our Australian government's imperialism, whether it's the imperialist support for Palestine, their own militarism, their warmongering around China, any attempts to dominate the Pacific. We now have a class that can actually has the power and interest to resist that. And in the process, that class can pose a solution to the system that produces the genocidal violence from Gadigal to Gaza. Workers' power isn't just disruptive of the settler colonial state, of the imperialist state. At its height, it means a collective choice about how to direct our time working in order to make life better instead of making someone else's profits. And on this continent, that would represent an incredibly important opportunity to foster the deepest and most profound collaboration between people with the oldest living civilization on Earth, developing on the insights we can learn from a society that did not have class, exploitation, war, and environmental destruction, but instead has over 65,000 years of knowledge of how to look after each other in this continent. And by building the power to decide collectively on what basis we will work, we can all be part of building a world based on that kind of respect for each other and the natural world on a much larger scale than has ever been achieved before.